anyone not ready? Again, this is Mission San Jose KK Team 100 speaking at first, and Selena Cow is the first speaker. We affirm the resolution resolved. The Republic of India should sign the Artemis Accords. Our first contention is launching India into the future. For the past several years, Kumar 21 explains that India has funneled billions of dollars into space annually. Despite Prime Minister Modi attempting to increase investment with privatization and government subsidies, the nation still lags behind global powers, accounting for barely 2% of global space commerce. Fortunately, Ramanathan 21 writes that the Artemis Accords would tap into this potential, providing India access to robotics from Canada, avionics from Japan, and network expertise from the US. JOF 22 furthers that commitments to share scientific data and technology, the Accords would allow India to join a global space supply chain. Thus, Upadhyay 23 explains that signing would send a signal of future growth and commitment to the space industry while encouraging investment towards startups. Historically, Goschuk 22 explains that when India agreed to cooperate with Australia on the Guyanian project, they saw an additional $42 million in funding. The Artemis Accord, Human 22 finds that India's space economy has the potential to become the key driver of national economic growth and lift millions of people out of poverty. Our second contention is fostering cooperation. Decades after the Cold War, Cornell 16 explains that the few previously created space agreements have fallen apart. With a new space race underway, CNBC 22 writes that Russia and China have ramped up space militarization, conducting several missile tests in recent years. According to the Pentagon last year, China is set to overtake the US in space. Luckily, Smith 21 explains that as the largest democracy and a major non-Western signatory, India would legitimize the Accords while prompting other countries to join. Because they have previously collaborated with Russia and China, signing the Accords and moving closer to the US strengthens the Accords. This is crucial for two reasons, and the first is setting space norms. Klempner 22 reports that the international space race has begun as 70 countries have established space agencies. However, Raymond 21 finds that international rules in space are unclear and deteriorating. Newer space programs often lack the precautions of developed ones, which is why Klempner continues that the Artemis Accords are needed to create a safe framework for space exploration. Rapodowski 22 details that the Accords are actively anti-space militarization. He continues that the treaty hasn't gained enough traction and aggression and has only continued to grow. Russia and China, for example, have launched more missile tests than ever before in space. Ensuring peace in space is critical, as Gallagher 15 explains that attacks on satellites, which are necessary for sustaining the internet, financial systems, and more, could devastate the economy and plunge millions of people into poverty. The second is strengthening the Quad. Bangery 22 finds that the Quad, a strategic partnership between Australia, India, Japan, and the US, is looking towards space. He furthers that India is the only member of the party to not have joined the Accords yet. However, Upadhyay 22 explains that if they were to sign the Artemis, it would open an important avenue for Quad cooperation, as Silverstein 22 contextualizes that rather than a collection of loosely related commitments, all Quad members signing the Accords would signal unity. Crucially, the Quad has planned projects to tackle orbital debris. As Suzuki 21 writes that India's geographic position allows it to monitor both hemispheres, and the country has invested significantly in debris removal. Unchecked, Stanley 20 finds that debris could destroy satellites and push millions of people into poverty. Apart from space, a unified Quad would also bolster deterrence. In recent years, Rashid 20 explains that the Quad has acted as a strategic counterweight to China's expansion of authoritarianism in the Indo-Pacific. To protect millions of lives, we are so proud to affirm.
Just as a brief introduction, I'm Sterling Sia, speaking for Leland SX on the NEG, and our team code's 322. Is everyone ready? Okay. Then my time starts now. India's neutrality is a cornerstone of its international policy, one of the only reasons it has been able to accelerate economically and politically at such a rapid rate. Unfortunately, Newman 20 finds the Artemis Accords destroy this neutrality, swing India toward the West. Amidst the West push for India to sign the Accords, Geary 20 reports that India must maintain its neutrality or sacrifice its current relations. As such, Rain and I negate to resolve the Republic of India should sign the Artemis Accords. Our sole contention is picking a side. India's political polarization by signing the Accords will cause a power struggle and conflict in the international community. There's two reasons. Subpoint A is undermining international law. Ever since the Outer Space Treaty, which over 130 countries signed, international organizations have developed guidelines to govern space responsibly. Skiba in 2022 explains that delegates from 50 countries recently met to begin drafting new guidelines for behavior in space. India is key in these agreements. The UN Office of Outer Space Affairs in 2020 states that India is active in international forums that discuss space practices. India has signed all major space treaties and closely follows sustainability guidelines. Additionally, India is a major power in space. DO23 states that India has conducted substantial lunar research and was the 4th country to ever reach Mars. India has a strong grip over international norms regarding space, however, signing would shatter progress for 2 key reasons. First is dividing major countries. The Artemis Accords fragment global consensus. Hogue, director of the Institute of Space Law, notes that the Artemis Accords were not developed by an international committee. Instead, they were dictated by the US. That's exactly why Newman 20 finds most countries with strong space programs like Russia, China, and Germany oppose the US-centric Artemis Accords, whereas they have all signed international treaties regarding space. The Artemis Accords will never be effective so long as most major countries oppose it. Second is contradicting existing laws. Stern 20 explains that American bias in the Artemis Accords exploit loopholes to shift space norms in an attempt to weaken existing international law. For example, the Accords allow countries to acquire and claim territory in space, which is banned by international law. For these 2 reasons, Hogue explains that every additional country that signs the Accords means another step away from existing international law like the Outer Space Treaty. Unfortunately, Aremu 21 explains that international law is critical to protecting cooperation beyond the bounds of space. Critically, Posner 13 of the University of Chicago explains strengthened international law cooperation increases the global economy by 3.9%. Subpoint B is Russian roulette. Freire 23 explains India and Russia have become strong trade partners for cheap oil and military supplies. Unfortunately, Newman 20 concludes that signing the Artemis Accords would be Russia's signal that India was shifting toward the West and losing its neutral position, severing ties between India and Russia. Devastatingly, Prahalad 22 concludes, with today's high tensions between the East and West, signing the Artemis Accords would collapse any relations between India and Russia. Indian neutrality is critical to ending conflict. Rohera 22 explains that because of India's neutrality amidst Russia's ostracization on the international stage as a result of the Ukraine war, Russia doesn't see India as antagonizing. As such, India has been able to bring Russia to the negotiating table. These negotiations save lives. Gettleman 22 finds when Russia attempted to take over the Ukraine nuclear power plants, India was the one who stepped in to prevent a possible nuclear catastrophe. Again, Gettleman finds India's diplomacy convinced Vladimir Putin to accept the grain deal, opening Ukraine's ports in the Black Sea to food exports, helping end hunger in the region. As Ukraine is a key supplier of grain across the world, Kadasova 22 finds that these food exports have saved 100 million people from extreme poverty. And thus, we are proud to negate. I'm moving across.
Alright, good for us.
Yeah.
Alright, can I take the first question?
Go for it.
Why can't India be part of the Outer Space Treaty and also Artemis Accords?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So the Artemis Accords are very US-centric and it specifically violates international law like the Outer Space Treaty.
So,
and because of this, India is basically saying, like, we're able to follow 2 separate policies, which they can't do, which is why they can't sign.
So why can't India just sign on to Artemis Accords and then improve it based on their own opinions and make it better?
That's not how it works, right? We specifically tell you the Artemis Accords are led by a US corporation, whereas the Outer Space Treaty is led by international committees that make these guidelines, so that India has no sway in the Artemis Accords.
So you're saying that none of the 21 countries that join the Artemis Accords can make any decisions except for the US?
We're saying that the actual important decisions are made by the US, yeah.
But no other country can make any decision or put any of their
If you can
opinions
give me
to
evidence
opinion.
otherwise, yes, that's true.
Alright, sure, you can take a question.
Okay, so let's go to your first contention about launching India to the future, right? So is there no scientific sharing right now?
So we would say that the scientific sharing right now is really bad, but also secondly, it's not enough, which is why they've stayed and stagnated at 2% of the global space commerce. Can I take a question?
Wait, just really quick, a follow-up question, right? So if scientific sharing is so bad right now, how can we see all these programs like the US and India and Russia and India creating all these space initiatives to bring more satellites into space and like launching to the moon.
First of all, that contradicts your own argument because if the US and India are already collaborating, then that means that Russia should have already been antagonized. But second of all, we would say, yeah, hold on really quickly, right? But second of all, we would say that multilateralism is always better than bilateralism as opposed for like trading and sharing for these information, because only in the Artemis Accords can several countries work together and actually collaborate across hemispheres and combine their information together as opposed to like two individuals. Can I take a question?
Just really quickly on like what you just said, right? Because you just talked for a long time. So on the first point, you're saying like there's a lot like there's like first on your second point, you say there's like a lot of bilateral agreements, but the Artemis Accords are literally a set of bilateral agreements anyways. And your first point about antagonizing like Russia, you're seeing that there's bilateral agreements between the US and India and Russia and India, which maintains their neutral position. So there's no like hostility.
Yeah, and we would say that if that can happen, then it could also happen because the Artemis Accords doesn't say that India can't work with Russia and China. Wait, really quickly, right? Can't work with Russia and China. And then on the second point, we would also say that multilateralism is uniquely different from bilateralism because in the Quad, when you have different people working together on combined projects under the Artemis Accords, that's very different from the US and India just sharing. Can I take a question?
Okay,
We've spent a lot of time.
Yeah.
Which of the 21 countries who signed on the Accords did Russia retaliate against?
India is a very unique actor because they've been able to maintain a neutral position between the US and Russia. So as soon as India sees the swaying toward the US, that's when they cut off ties. This uniquely isn't true for any of the other countries that have signed those Artemis Accords right now.
Why?
These are all major US allies that have already been away from Russia.
Why is India unique though?
Because India is a unique neutral actor that has bilateral agreements with both the US and Russia.
So no other countries have been neutral?
No, they haven't been the specific ambiguity that India has been in being neutral.
All right, sure, we can talk about it.
We'll take a little bit of prep before approval. Right, is everyone ready? So to reiterate, I'm Videsh Kadnani, second speaker for Team 100, Mission San Jose on the affirmative, and it's just going to be responding to the negative case. They tell you that India has been a neutral nation in space. That is exactly why they need to join the Artemis Accords. We tell you that India coming to the table would legitimize the Accords, causing other countries to sign on, but crucially, it's never caused retaliation in the past. We tell you that India can be a part of the Artemis Accords and work with Russia and China at the same time. That's historically why when they signed a bilateral agreement with the US in space, Russia didn't do anything. If anything, they increased competition and signed another deal with India because they wanted India to work with them. You see, there's just more competition and more collaboration in a world with the Artemis Accords. There's another example of Mexico who signed onto the Artemis Accords and 2 months later signed another agreement with Russia, which shows that it's not just one and done, you can have multilateralism. But specifically, let's talk about their first contention and this idea of international law. Sure, while the US may have been the one spearheading Artemis, we see that it's still multilateral at heart. Organizations like the European Space Agency and NASA come together to decide the rules under Artemis, which is why we see that India would just bring better norms to the table. So if they're saying that we want to make sure we have good norms in space, that is a reason to add India if they themselves say they've been perpetuating such great norms. But specifically, they say you divide countries. First, the same countries like France that they cite did eventually sign on to Artemis, which shows that there is growing consensus in the international community. They're moving forward on it. But second, we tell you India is good because, again, it legitimizes the Accords. That is eventually what can bring other actors like Russia and China to the table. Second, they say it contradicts things like the Outer Space Treaty. First, Artemis is built on the foundations of the Outer Space Treaty. In nearly every single section of the document, it cites the Outer Space Treaty, and the same things they talk about, like privatization, weren't even touched in the treaty. That's why we say Artemis is crucial, because it builds on that treaty which was signed 70 years ago and actually has clear guidelines in space. That's why you see that more and more countries have been signing on as time passes. But then, they say that if we have global cooperation, it can cause 3.9% economic growth. They haven't proven you a single impact. We've had more countries joining Artemis. Has global cooperation gone down? No, there's only been more collaboration in space, which shows that we're not dividing, we're building a community. Then, they talk about how you're going to have actors shifting to the West, and that directly antagonizes countries like Russia. First, we would argue that India can still stay neutral. They haven't given you a single example of a nation that's been retaliated against after they moved to the Artemis Accords. And with India, they again signed a bilateral agreement with the US, and you didn't see any Russian retaliation. Second, we would say that Russia doesn't even have a choice. If you have the Artemis Accords, it builds up things like deterrence. There's an international bloc that has all this space technology. Russia has no choice but to comply. But second, their only example of India stepping in is when Turkey actually negotiated a settlement. The power plant was negotiated by Turkey because Turkey is a much better ally with Russia than India, which means, again, it doesn't matter if we have India being great friends with them. But then, we would say that again, all that's happened in the past is that India stepping in has meant more competition. Russia has offered them more deals and had more technology sharing with India as a result of the Artemis Accords because they want to remain competitive in space, which means that signing the Accords is not a choice between Russia and the US, it just means that you get more competition on net. Finally, if you look to what's happening right now, you see that Russia and China have been militarizing at exponential rates, launching more anti-satellite tests than ever before. The only risk of getting rid of this is if you, again, build up deterrence. That is what forces them to decrease their tests, and insofar as we see that they're being uncontrollable right now, that is a net reason to affirm. We've seen that nearly every single country joining the Artemis Accords have seen record economic growth, more collaboration than ever, and no antagonization. So if you're going to be voting for history in this round, you're going to be voting for Team 100 from the affirmative.
Can I get a couple pieces of evidence?
Yeah.
Did I see Russia sharing more chat?
Just to introduce myself before the speech, I'm Rain. I'm the second negation speaker in today's round. In this speech, we're first going to be covering the arguments you just heard. Then we'll be covering a quick overview, then my opponent's case. Mission? All right, judges ready? Perfect. We're going to quick sip of water, actually. Sorry. Cool. Time starts now. The first response they make is that historically we haven't seen retaliation. We tell you there's two key things. One, India is a specific actor. For the duration of the Cold War, for over 70 years, they've historically played down the middle as per Newman and Geary evidence that goes conceded. Why is this crucial? Because when you look at countries like Mexico, they have not had the same history of playing down the middle. That's our argument. When you have the fourth largest historically neutral space power switching, you see these things. And they say they've cooperated in the past with the US. The issue is that our Whittington evidence isolates Russia views the Accords as an extension of NATO. And last time a country tried to join NATO, they got invaded, as you look to the Ukrainian war. Then they say organizations come together to dictate terms like first of all, the Catholic card literally just says NASA spearheaded. But second, once the Artemis Accords are written, they cannot be physically changed because it's a document. They said France signed on and all the other US friends, but realize these are US countries that are part of NATO. Of course, they're part of the Western sphere of influence. Our arguments when you have a non-Western country joining over, that uniquely triggers the change. They say Artemis Accords doesn't actually contradict international law, but insofar as literally has space provision to allow lunar mining, which is like word for word prohibited when you look at something like the International Space Treaty, we'd say it's pretty different. Then, they build this whole argument how having India on board builds deterrence with Russia. First, realize Artemis is a literal peaceful program. There's no military deterrence happening. But second, Russia is willing to cut ties because if they see it as a threat to their security, they will evenly jeopardize their economy. They say only Turkey solved the Ukrainian crisis, but if you look to our evidence specifically, it isolates India as the one who solved the nuclear power plant incident and a large contributor to the grain deal that saved 100 million lives. With that said, let's talk about a quick observation on their case. In order to have the investment, strengthen international law, and overall issues they talk about, then countering China, you need strong international law. If nobody trusts each other, nobody will work together. But second, on our argument about Russia, our evidence finds the best way to deter China is to have a strong Russian presence to check back against any growing Chinese influence. That's the reason you're always looking to our case first. With that said, let's talk about their arguments a bit more specifically. On this idea that India is lacking investment, this isn't true, but our evidence from 2022 explains that there's been over $100 million of capital flowing into India, and it's only growing. That's crucial because they don't tell you how the Artemis Accords uniquely solved. Then you look to our Kayakdo response, which explains to you when you have this foreign investment, you become reliant on it, which is why when you see 10% increase in investment, there's a 4 to 6% increase in poverty rates because you can't generate your own things. Sure, this isn't specific to the space sector, but when you look at generic economic trends, this is the thing you're seeing play out. Then, let's go on to their argument about cooperation. First, realize India spearheading COPIS, the UN version of Artemis Accords. We say this is crucial for two reasons. One, COPIS is unbiased because you're getting 170 countries to work together, which means India could get funding from 170 countries. Comparatively, if India suddenly changes its response, then they'd see like a hypocrite only delegitimizing the Artemis Accords. Let's talk about their argument on setting norms. First, what our stern evidence finds is that Artemis Accords are use and exploitation of the moon in order to get benefits for America first. They say that Europe has worked on it. Sure, they may have added a word or two, but for centuries it's been West-centric. Every single country in the Artemis Accords is a close friend with the US, and that's crucial because when you have India, an international perspective, they will not have their voice heard because they'll just be in an echo chamber of 20 aligned nations. Second, you look to our argument about Russia to solve back for these, because if India can work with Russia, they can strengthen international law. Third, the only reason you have to look about this issue about satellites is because the Artemis Accords have breed mistrust. That means when you're looking at their argument on international law, nobody trusts the Artemis Accords, so nobody will follow it in the first place. Let's talk about the Quad. First, what Bondi 21 finds that the leaders literally came out in a joint statement reaffirming their support in space to strengthen the Quad. We've already seen that happen. But second, we'd say Quad cooperation is only effective when you have every single country working together. Insofar as other countries are splintering off, you will never have a strong presence to deter China. It is a very easy ballot for the nation. I'm good for cross whenever.
So you tell me that COPIS is unbiased and a better way for India to get things like funding.
Yep.
Why can't they be part of both?
So what we tell you is when you have India switch over, it makes them seem like a hypocrite.
Why are they switching over?
Let me finish. Because when you sign the Artemis Accords, you start working on the Artemis Accords, and this has two bad implications. First, they seem like a hypocrite because they're going against the policies they've been working on for the past 20 years. But second, which obviously lowers their credibility.
Okay.
But second, it seems like they don't have strong values in the international sphere, as far as they're embodying policies that aren't representative of the total worldview. Can I take a question?
Really quickly, COPIS is embedded in the Artemis Accords. It is literally cited in the Artemis Accords several times.
And I can
And
cite
really quickly, name me one country that has signed the Artemis Accords and seen a decrease in funding because these 170 countries have pulled out.
So that's not the argument. Well, let's talk about the first thing you said where COPIS is specifically cited. The issue is, sure, I can say I cite the Outer Space Treaty all I want, but the actual text of Artemis Accords does not follow the Outer Space Treaty.
What does it violate?
As I said in rebuttal, they violate the lunar extraction module. That's important because Artemis Accords allow companies to go to the moon.
COPIS?
Let me finish.
Okay.
They violate things like outer space treaties, where you can go to the moon, take out a bunch of rocks, and bring them back. That's expressly prohibited when you look at a treaty like the Outer Space Treaty. There's a clear difference. We spent a minute 15. Can I get a question?
Really quickly,
We
things
spent
like
a
the
minute
outer.
15.
Yeah,
Can I get a
go
question,
ahead.
please?
We'll get back to this.
Thank you. Let's talk about, so let's go into this whole issue about the Quad.
Mm-hmm.
If Russia's antagonizing in space so much, why hasn't countries like Mexico been able to slow their growth?
Can you repeat that?
If Russia, you tell me China has been expanding in space so massively, why haven't the 20 countries that have already joined the Artemis Accord been enough to slow China's growth?
Well, they have slowed their growth. They're actively competing with China, and they're becoming a much larger part of the
your
space
evidence
sector.
is from
All the
2021,
nations,
right? That's an issue when we see
No,
new
no.
countries joining as of 2023.
Yeah, like for
and you
example,
still claim this is
Rwanda,
an
for
issue.
example, Nigeria joined recently, and they also saw their space sector grew
I'm not
exponentially.
talking about the space sector. I'm talking about
Yeah,
China's growth on your second sub. Did you tell me that
Oh,
historically?
like their growth in authoritarianism,
Yes.
right? Yeah, we're saying that the Quad is the way you counteract that. The Artemis Accords are relating to space, right? The Quad is directly a
I
security
understand
agreement
what you're
that
telling me
does
about
things
the
down
Quad, but
here.
if countries have been New Zealand, what does India bring that Australia and New Zealand and
Well,
can't do already?
we tell you that every single Quad nation except India is on the Artemis Accords. But moreover, we tell you that India is in the best geographical location where they can analyze both hemispheres and get satellite data. And also,
Do
they have the
satellites-
most innovative small satellites that
So
are being
are
more
satellites tied to
effective
a
for-
string right over the country? No, they orbit the entire Earth. Why can't American
Yeah,
satellites
but
from New Zealand and
Satellites
Australia
also communicate
track
with technology and infrastructure on Earth. That's
Wait, I
how
mean,
they
I
work.
could,
That's why
tell
I can show
something-
you an author that actually talks about this and details why India's in the
I
best
can also
geographical
show you
location.
evidence saying I can talk to people in Australia because satellites orbit and I can still get the data over there.
Yes, but you also have tracking systems on Earth. But regardless, our point, right, is that India is also the one innovating the most in things like small satellites that actually bring the debris back home, which means that the only way you can have an effective way to do this is with India. It's why it hasn't been happening in the past.
both countries. Critically, this is too far of a move towards the US, which offsets the complete balance.
So
don't
I'd
take
say-
it
I'd say
from
saying it's a
blatant
further
evidence,
move-
which you guys just don't
Saying
respond
it's a further move than a bilateral agreement. Saying a multilateral
Yes,
move
because
is
you're
worse than
signing
a
a
bilateral
comprehensive
agreement.
space
It's
treaty,
pretty-
which completely
Wait.
ties
No,
you
because
in.
here's the key problem, right? The Artemis Accords, nowhere in the Artemis Accords does it say that India can't work with Russia anymore.
Exactly.
So why doesn't it make sense that they can have a bilateral agreement and also work with Russia
Which
if
is-
they can't do a multilateral agreement and also work with Russia?
Which is
as
why
well?
Mexico joined this
We'd
so-called
love to answer
NATO,
Selena's
and
question
then
if we had the
Russia worked with them
opportunity.
at the same
Yeah,
time.
so the very problem with every argument you give, first let's talk about Mexico. Mexico isn't representative of what
Yeah, I
happens
get
within. Can I just finish the answer? Like,
Uh-huh.
the problem with Mexico is that it's not in the same neutral Goldilocks position as India, and that uniquely deteriorates ties.
Well,
But then
Mexico
second, can I
clearly
just finish
is-
like the second part of your
Yeah.
question, right? That was very cross. So the second part, what you also say like there's going to be like a deterioration of cooperation overall, but no, the problem with that is the Artemis Accords specifically are also a set of bilateral agreements, but they're very strongly biased toward the West,
Really?
and they're very much U.S. centric, which is why you trade all these
clearly
problems. But
is
that's not
neutral,
cross.
considering they were in the Artemis Accords and signed deals with Russia.
But that's not cross.
I think we have 25 seconds.
Okay, is everyone ready? So it'll follow a pretty similar structure to their last speech, starting on their side with international law, provoking Russia, and then ending on the affirmative case. They say that there are 170 signatories under the Outer Space Treaty, so you see more investment and collaboration there. Well, they can't name you a single country that joined Artemis and lost funding. We tell you on net, Nigeria, Rwanda, and so forth joined the Artemis Accords, and they saw that they were working more with these 20 countries, and they were still working with the other 170 countries, which is why on net, it's not a choice between the Artemis Accords and the Outer Space Treaty, it's just more multilateralism. Don't let Rayon try to get out of this in his final focus, it's been conceded. But specifically, we tell you that the reason it doesn't violate international law is twofold. First, the Artemis Accords are built on the foundation of the Outer Space Treaty. They cite it nearly every single time, so joining the Artemis Accords only re-legitimizes it. But the Outer Space Treaty is redundant. It was created in the 1950s, and since then a lot has changed in space. The Artemis Accords are the only way to make a more comprehensive deal, and that's why we see that it's just growing and gaining more traction as time goes on. Let's talk about this idea of shifting west, though. First, the only example they give you is when India negotiated a deal with Russia. They have conceded throughout the entire round that India wasn't even the major actor here. It was Turkey, which means functionally they have no impact. There's no reason to even evaluate this. But moreover, we would say that going with India only means that now Russia offers more deals. They want to compete because that's how they remain competitive, which is why every single time India's moved a little closer to the West, Russia has backed out of that with more competition. You're not going to see Russia ending diplomatic relations. That only isolates them further. They've never done it in the past. Finally, let's talk about the affirmative case. We tell you that the only way to foster cooperation on things like space norms and strengthen the Quad is if India joins. They just say that overall they're going to have more mistrust, but we tell you that uniquely India is the best actor to bridge that mistrust. Because they work with Russia, they can bridge the gap between the Artemis Accords and Russia and China. And moreover, they are critical because we tell you every single nation in the Quad has gone behind the Accords, except India. You get rid of that and you deter conflict in space. Fundamentally, if they're saying space is getting more violent, then the only way to get that down is through the Artemis Accords and building consensus. That's what happens when you vote for the affirmative.
To reintroduce myself, I'm Rain. I'm the second negation speaker in today's round. The order's going to be the same as Videsh, sorry. It's going to go on the funding debate, international law, then we'll talk about Russia. Mission, good? Judges ready? Perfect. Let's start on this whole debate about investment. They don't say the words Nishat in their last speech, and that's where they lose the round. Nishat is a 30-year study which analyzes whenever you increase foreign inflows by 10%, poverty rates increase by 4 to 6%. That's crucial. You're not creating your own investment, you're becoming increasingly reliant on other countries to do the work for you. That means when eventually the investment does get pulled out, you're seeing these massive crashes in the economy. They say the space sector booms in the short term. Sure, it is the space sector in the short term, but our 30-year study specifically analyzes the total effects and finds this increase in reliance is what decreases the overall economy and increases poverty. Don't trust me, trust the 30-year study. It's very easy to vote right there. Let's talk about this next argument about international law. They say it's built on the foundation. My speech is also built on the foundation of the one you just heard, but it's completely different. The same thing happens with the Artemis Accords. They allow lunar extraction material, which is fundamentally prohibited by the Outer Space Treaty. Insofar as there's an implicit contradiction written out in the treaty, I'd say they don't line up at all. They say that the Outer Space Treaty is from 1960s and outdated, but they can see that India is working with other countries to build a new one that is better and uniquely solving back for the issues they talked about. Only switching to the Artemis Accords make India look like a hypocrite, which A, doesn't legitimize the Artemis Accords, but B, erodes India's credibility on a global scale. That's crucial, because now that you can't vote for them and you're even voting for us on funding, let's talk about our argument about Russia. It's very simple. India historically has been for the past 70 years, has been in the perfect state between the West and the East, being able to mediate conflict. They say that India hasn't been able to mediate conflict well. Look at the second paragraph of the evidence we see. We see India specifically solve the nuclear power plant incident. That's crucial, because when you have things like that, they saved 100 million people from food insecurity when you look at things like the Ukrainian grain deal. They go all in on this response that many countries didn't get retaliated against. No, neither will India. Don't trust me, look at our Whittington evidence, which comes from the foreign policy minister of Russia. From the Kremlin themselves, they see it as a NATO reincarnation. Remember, the last time a country tried to join NATO, they literally got attacked. Argument isn't that the attack will happen, it's that Russia's more than willing to sever diplomatic ties. It's so very simple. You have to trust the sources. It's an easy negative about it. Good round, y'all.
Good job.